Welcome back. We're now at part 4, the end of our discussion on demystifying DoDAF. We're going to talk now about what else you might need to know, primarily looking at sources of information and how to access them. We'll start with a look at the DoDAF website and walk our way through the various tabs that exist there. First step is to actually access the website itself. We've done that several times throughout parts 2, 3. We're looking at all the various tabs on the left to start with, the indices of the parts of DoDAF. Starting with the background, you can access the introduction and a variety of discussions about the background of how DoDAF has gotten to where it is. It does emphasize conformance at this point. It lays out these 6 core processes that DoD uses and that DoDAF supports. Talk a little bit about how the DoD Architecture Framework Data Meta Model supports these 6 processes, and we look at what's been new and added to DoDAF. Next section, the architecture development, introduces the 6 steps. It's a little bit more detail than we provided in the discussion in part 2. I recommend you read that to find out the additional comments on each of those steps. The meta model itself is another detailed area. You'll see that it talks about the DM2 and the various parts, the conceptual data model, the logical data model, and the physical exchange schema. It also adds in a little bit more detail on the ontology. There is a group of people called IDEAS, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, has laid this foundation. That's the supporting mechanism of a DM2. Moves on to viewpoints. The viewpoints are, as I discussed, all textual, very few graphics at all associated with this. So you need to read these to find out how they describe each of the viewpoints. And then I recommend you go back to version 1.5, volume 2, to look at the illustrations that help you better visualize the type of information. Do recall that the viewpoints and the models are simply the things that you use to illustrate, to represent the data. Everything starts with the meta model, as we talked earlier. Moving on to presentation techniques, DoDAF 2 starts talking about how to use the models and the viewpoints. They talk about bringing in a variety of views together in a composite view. They fuse data, making a higher level aggregate view, and they also show how it relates back to other reference models. The configuration management overview is not of interest to a lot of people because it's really what program managers and other people running in your particular project and your architecture need to know about how DoDAF is managed for configuration purposes. And finally, the last major item on the list is the acronym and glossary list, fairly standard, listing of the acronyms and abbreviations, followed by the glossary that lists terms and definitions. So these are a fairly minor part of the taxonomy and ontology, as I talked about in part 2. Then we go to the archives. The archives are where you actually do find volume 2, volume 1 and 3 as well, but volume 2 is where you find the illustrations for each of the models from which you would add data and derive the views. Now moving toward the top, we have several tabs that take us to different websites that are associated with DoDAF, in some cases using DoDAF, in other cases they are supporting development of data. The first one is the DM2 working group. This is their website. This is a group that is fairly large, meets online. In fact, we have a meeting most months where we talk about how we're developing the metadata understructure for the DoDAF. The journal itself is something published every 3 to 6 months. The last update was some months ago. On here you should find a lot of information about DoDAF, describing, for example, on the far left, you'll see some conference briefings, although they only have a few from 2011. 2010 has many more. It will show you some guidelines and some best practices. For example, the AV2, the Integrated Dictionary, and the OV6C designs are shown there, so you can access them for examples. There's archives for the previous journals, and for those of you who have more questions, the frequently asked questions is not bad as well. You can also contact them from this page. If you go down to the bottom, you'll see architectural processes and a variety of other things. These are just additional information about what they have listed here. The journal itself does not yet have many illustrations. That's the reason why I keep pushing you to look at version 1.5 and the illustrations there to get a visual idea of what we're talking about when we talk about views and the models populated with data. The archives are where they will keep previous versions and other information. You'll see here that we, again, just a few discussion points on the AV2 and the 6C, but this will probably expand in the future. I recommend you continue to look at it. I also point out that in the lower right-hand corner you have full briefings that are exemplars of how people have been using DoDAF version 2.0. For example, the search and rescue example, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the unified development of a common architecture framework with the Brits and with other international partners. Moving on to the metadata registry. This is a support mechanism for the DM2. It deals with a lot of data services. Many of you may not have to deal with this, but it's good to know that it's there, and those of you who do have to can access it more readily. The next tab takes you to Ideas, the International Defense Enterprise Architecture Specification. You may notice that defense is spelled with a C, which means it's an international organization. It's made up of 5 countries in NATO: Australia, UK, US, Canada, Sweden, and then NATO, as I mentioned. The purpose is to develop the data exchange formats for military enterprise architectures. Remember that the DoD architecture framework is part of the DoD enterprise architecture, and the DoD enterprise architecture is part of the federal enterprise architectural framework within the U.S. government. So this is going to be a fairly essential part of the evolution for the future. Going back to the version 2 website, you'll find a link for other links. A key one there is the DoD Architecture Registry System. This particular site is where you would actually register your architecture once you receive a point of finality. You will probably put the AV1 here and a few keywords for searching. It is to a place where we have the catalog of all the other architectures, and people will search among them to find examples of where they need to interface on the one hand and examples of how they may improve their own content on the other. It's going to be a fairly key site that you'll be working with. 2 other sites I'll highlight on the links page. The first is the AKO DKO for the Army Knowledge Online and Defense Knowledge Online. You have to have an account there, but it is a source of information within the U.S. government for those of you who have access to it. A lot of that will apply to access to many regulations that are not privileged for open source, but you will need to access them as you build your architectures. The Ministry of Defense, I mentioned earlier, they're playing in the ideas, but they've also been working more directly with DoDAF, and as a result, it's worthwhile to understand what's going here. You won't necessarily have access to all parts of it, but some you do, and it's worthwhile to note this website as well. From this website, you can also access the NATO architecture framework, but that does require a password, and so most people will not be able to use it. I've simply highlighted where you may find it. So we come back to one of the last questions, and that is, with all the investment we're putting in this DoDAF and learning how to use it, is it going to change? Well, I can guarantee you it will. The whole history of DoDAF has been one of change, starting in the mid-90s, developing the C4ISR architecture framework, and instead of coming out with version 2.0 of that, they came out with DoDAF 1.0. The C4ISR architecture framework was already influencing NATO, and the DoDAF first version was a major influence for the development of the Ministry of Defense architecture framework in the UK. DoDAF 1.0 also was an influence for the Canadian architecture framework, and that's up in the upper right-hand corner. The NATO and the Ministry of Defense architecture frameworks developed somewhat in parallel over the next few years. In fact, the NATO had a lot of influence on one of the versions of MODAF, and then the Ministry of Defense, NATO, and the DoD started working together, and 2.0 reflects a lot of the interaction. It is more a blending. In fact, major parts of the new DoDAF are from the influence of the MOD. We're going to see this unified approach coming out in the future and is more likely to come out in 2012. In fact, back last year at the Enterprise Architecture Conference, OSD gave us a hint at where they were going. This particular roadmap shows the history prior to 2011. In 2011, what we're looking at is improving the model descriptions and doing a better job of integrating their use, providing better guidance, and making sure that these models with the views that result are supporting the processes that are key to the Department of Defense. They promised us that in 2012 we're likely to see a DoDAF 2.1 version. It's going to be dealing with some evolutionary thoughts. One of the biggest things is it's going to get outside of actual architecture restrictions and move and using the architecture to support a variety of things. But the principal support remains for the 6 key processes within the Department of Defense. What other influences are we likely to have? Well, Congress has been speaking a lot about using what we have going here with the DoDAF. They are trying to manage their expenditures better. We've talked about a lot of restricted budgets, and the Federal Enterprise Architecture Framework itself is likely to change, probably because of congressional pressure and the need for Congress to start using that. We have the additional influence that I talked about, interacting internationally with NATO and the other nations. That is going to influence. And then within DoD itself, the acquisition goals, the processes are changing. We're talking about streamlining, making things happen more quickly, moving items to the warfighter much more quickly to save lives and improve our situation and security. There's also a fairly strong push within OSD to streamline system engineering and make it more effective. So we see that within AT&L, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics is trying to improve system engineering in all its parts. The latest QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, was emphasizing the fact that we have to have better portfolio management, and that really is driving us more toward having much tighter relationships among all the programs that we're maintaining on the one hand or trying to improve on the others. So you will see changes in the DoDAF to reflect support and influence from all of these. So in summary, what have we accomplished here in this little bit more than 2 hours? Well, we learned what an architecture is. It is a fundamental unifying structure. It has a whole lot of parts. Very key among them is the relationship to the parts and understanding the process and applying them with rigor, consistency, and discipline. What is a framework? Well, the framework is very much an architecture, but in this particular case, it is a data-centric framework. It applies to all of DoD. It's intended to support decision-making throughout the DoD, especially in the 6 core processes. The use of DoDAF is absolutely essential. So how do I use DoDAF? Well, you've got to know your stakeholders. You have to choose a methodology and apply that with rigor, discipline, and consistency. And then make sure that you are applying DM2. That is a very key part of supporting the decision makers because they will be accessing the integrated set of architectures through the DARs to make comparisons and decisions. If you do not use DoDAF, remember that your program is likely to be in jeopardy. Will the DoDAF change in the future? Absolutely. And the principal influences are internal, but we have a lot of external influences over which we have no control in the Department of Defense, and they will influence us as well. Now, we've talked about throughout the 4 parts the sources of information. Where we could, we have given you websites and hyperlinks to that information. This is a summary of some of those. Here you'll see all the stuff associated with the DoD version, DoDAF version 2.0 website. We also include access to each of the principal Joint Chiefs of Staff or DoD instructions and directives that apply that we've talked about earlier. And so we now ask if you do have questions, you can contact us at our website. Website itself is also a source for additional information about our training. But first, in terms of questions, you send us a question and we will do our best to answer and get back to you. There are other places you can seek answers, or go into the DoD Architecture Framework website itself, but we recommend you call us as well. This is a listing of the courses we have available, several of which are currently under revision to update them. You can contact us if you wish to have face-to-face instruction on any of these. We also have 2 books that Dr. Dam has written, one on the architecture framework and another will apply the principles of system engineering to proposal engineering. It's a fairly unique approach, but it's always successful. Dr. Dam is also working on another book to talk about DoDAF and how it relates to additional changes that we're likely to see in system engineering. This will be available soon on Amazon. So thank you for your time and good luck on your journey with use of DoDAF.